Today I get to play with a press that I have never seen before. I had heard they existed, but this is the first time I've actually seen one. It came into the shop just a couple of days ago, and now I've got it set up and I'm going to play with it. This is a Dillon RL300. This press, according to the history forums about Dillon Precision online, they made in the 70s less than 1,000 of these things, and they lost about $100 on each one. So it didn't last real long. But it's kind of a cool press. I want to go over a few things with you on this, and you can see how Dillon learned from the first one, and then they changed the design, and they incorporate new things into the 450, and then subsequent 550 and the like. But it is a 4-station, manually indexed progressive machine. Now, like the 450, the tool head's fixed. You don't have interchangeable tool heads. It does use a priming mechanism, a feed system that goes right here that is retained by a set screw, and it uses this plunger system. Now, obviously, I've got the feed system here, but I don't have it set up. Now, this particular press, it's got some problems with the feeding and then the insertion of the primer into the primer pocket that I was none too thrilled with. And frankly, I didn't want to spend a couple hours frustrated trying to figure it out before I do this. So I'm not going to use the feed mechanism. Instead, I am going to prime just using a handheld priming tool. Now, I could just drop one right here onto the plunger, and you push the handle forward, kind of like on the 550. You have a primer sitting there, you push the handle forward, and the plunger will push the primer into the primer pocket. This one, I went to prime a couple of different casings just because I was going to do it manually like that, and it crushed them. So I'm looking at it, and I'm thinking, well, maybe because it's just squared, it needs a little chamfer there at the top to help it kind of guide into the primer pocket. No, because I was comparing that with the Redding, with the K&M tool, with their plungers. They're all cut flat on top. There's no chamfer. So after looking at this, what I think is going on is the diameter of the plunger itself is a little bit large. So you've got this square corner hitting a square corner, and unless you put a pretty aggressive chamfer on the case itself, which I'd rather not do, I think I'd have to take this thing apart and start measuring everything, but I think the plunger is just a little bit too large in diameter, or this thing has been used so much that it's flattened out. When you hit something, it starts to peen it over, and it makes it larger in diameter. And that may be the issue with this one as well. So maybe if I took a fine file, rounded it up a little bit, or if you've got a metal lathe, you can put it in a lathe, take down a little bit of that outside diameter. It might work beautifully. I'm not going to do that. Just going to play with it. So station number one, we've got a 4-station manually indexed machine, has the sizing, decapping, and the priming unit is all right there in station number one. So I'm using an RCBS full-length die set today. So let's get started here. I'm going to put some lube on a casing. I'm going to run that up, and I'm just retaining this to the bench here with a couple of different C-clamps, and I'm going to put some of this Redding Imperial sizing die wax. I like using the wax on these. By the way, I did clean up some casings, and I wanted to use this, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, Ioso, the sizing lubricant and cleaner. It actually works really pretty well, but it does leave the cases a little bit oily. Now, ordinarily, that would not be an issue for me whatsoever if I were using a priming mechanism where I'm not physically handling the primers. But primers and oil don't get along real well, and I don't want my hands all gooped up with oil if I'm going to be handling the primers, because I am going to be using the K&M tool here. So for that reason, now I decap, and as I lowered this out of the decapping die, this little chute guides the spent primer into this aluminum cup. And it does actually a very wonderful job of making sure that those primers go into here and not on the floor. It's a little bit cumbersome, it's a little clunky, it's maybe not real elegant, but man, it does the job every single time. And after playing with this for a little while first, your primers go in the cup, they're not on the floor, which is kind of nice. So after I size, as I rotate now over to station number 2, now if I had been using the priming mechanism, I would have primed right there. But you know what, why don't I just do this right now? I'm going to grab my K&M tool, and I'm going to grab a primer out of my primer flip tray, drop that in here. I'm going to prime a casing right now. Now I've got some fired casings that have been fired, reloaded at least a couple of times, so getting them to seat is not an issue, but I've got my Wilson. I like the Wilson. It's got very sharp edges on it. I can cut a little chamfer on there if need be, and the primers will slide in pretty easily. But not needed. Here, now I rotate this around using my finger, pushing on the shell plate itself. The 550, they've got that little lever, kind of that starfish looking thing above the shell plate, and that makes it a little bit easier to turn it. But it's really no big deal just to grab your thumb or your finger and just rotate the shell plate right there. I move it over. Now this is going counterclockwise up into station 2, and I run that up. The plunger system is the same on the 300 as the subsequent 400 and the early 550s before they went where you had the fail-safe rod and the springs that pulled it back down. You've got the spring wrapped around the front of the powder hopper itself. So you push that forward, release it, and then the powder goes into the casing. They had the funnels down really pretty well right from the get-go, so they're not spilling powder all over the place. Now I haven't checked this against how well it would work on a 550 or the 450, or if they made any changes. It may be exactly the same shell plates and locator pins, because it is using the locator pin system the same way the subsequent presses do. But now I need to rotate this back around because I'm using a shortcut extrusion powder. I'm using Accurate Arms 4064, and I've got my notes right here of what I'm doing. Now I like to have my powder chargers spot on, so I have a Lyman M5 scale. Now this is a really old scale made by House, but this thing works beautifully and it's spot on. So I have this now. I drop my powder charge into the pan of the scale, and with a shortcut extrusion, I don't expect it to be spot on. Now I did a couple already. The first one was over and I had to take some out, which is unusual. Usually it's under, so I've got some in a trickler right here. This is an old house trickler, so if it was a couple tenths under, I would just trickle back up to exactly the powder charge I want. But this one, man, this one dropped spot on again, so that's 2 in a row. I got exactly the amount of powder that I wanted, and I don't have to fiddle with it. Now, when it comes to doing your dispensing with one of these hoppers like this, let me share this with you. You've got a cavity inside the charge. This is called the charge bar. Inside the charge bar, there's a cavity with a little chunk of metal in there. And as you screw in a screw or screw out the screw, the cavity gets larger or smaller. Now, to get this thing set up without spending all day going back and forth moving the screw in and out till I get the powder charge that I want, I measured out what I wrote on my notes here, 28.6 grains of Accurate 4064, and I had the charge bar on my bench right here, and I dumped the powder charge into there, and I'm holding the charge bar flat on the top of the bench, and I start screwing in the screw, and what it's doing is it's making that cavity smaller, smaller, smaller until the powder charge comes up level with the top of the charge bar, and it takes up all the space in the cavity. That's where I stop. That's a good starting point. So when I put the charge bar back into the dispenser itself, I know I'm going to be very close right from the start. And I only had to do a little bit of tweaking. And again, I dropped it so I'm a couple tenths under that I would, but if it's going to give me exactly what I want, I'm not going to complain. So I've got a prime casing here, got my funnel, and I'm going to dump that powder into the casing. Now, I have here, because I'm loading flat-based bullets, my Reading press right next door has a Lee universal expander on it, because you go to put a flat base bullet on top of a bottleneck casing like that, you kind of have to hold it with your fingers and guide it into the seating die, and then it'll seat just fine. But here we've got this issue of the seating die is in back. Now I have to kind of reach around a little bit, well, not a little bit, I had to reach around to the back of the machine, put a bullet in there, and then run it up into the seating die. So I just don't want to fiddle with that. So I fixed that very easily by putting this case up into a universal expander from Lee. Now I'm just barely opening up the mouth of this casing. I mean, just barely enough to where I can set the projectile on top, take my fingers away, and it stays put. Now the seating die itself I have set up to where it's going to pretty much take that flare out and bring it back to its neutral position, but I'm not going to crimp with the RCBS seating die, which does have a crimp function, but I'm going to crimp in the fourth station with a Lee collet style. Let me explain that in just a minute. So let me get the bullet. Now look what I got to do here. I put the bullet on top. I got to look through the window in the front. Now I can seat it most of the way down. I lower it a little bit. I turn it a quarter turn. That gives me my concentricity that I'm looking for. And now I can rotate it around to the crimp, and I run that up. And the collet crimp, what it does is it comes from the outside and it squeezes it like that. And I've got this set up now to where it'll give me about 1,000th crimp. So there would be cartridge number 4 with the primer. It's below flush. The K&M typically will seat it about 3,000ths below flush. But if I'm going to check that real quick just to see, oh, this is telling me 5,000ths. Do that again. And that time it gave me 2. It's below flush. I don't have an issue with the primer being high, which is what I don't want. So you can see, as Dillon, they realize, with the design, how they're doing it, counterclockwise versus clockwise, where you're going to put your hand to see the bullet. The powder dispensing, this is legit. I mean, this thing, it comes out real positive. It goes in real positive. And I don't feel a whole bunch of crunching as I'm pushing the plunger bar, and then it comes back out. It's working real well. So it's got some nuances to it that probably aren't for everybody, but I'm kind of having fun here because this is just sort of cool. Anyway, I've got a whole bunch of 30-30 to make. I hope you have yourself a wonderful day. Happy